Throughout the ages, there have been great empires and civilizations that have risen up, their creators ruling nations, regions, and continents for hundreds, even thousands of years. Some of the great legacies and accomplishments of these empires may be lost in the mists of time, but from what they have left behind in rock and ruin, we can trace remarkable stories. In 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner wrote, "American democracy gained new strength each time it touched a new frontier."
The frontier wasn't just an extension of the United States, an outgrowth of its expansion westward. The frontier was what made the United States American. American democracy, American values were forged in the frontier.
Throughout its history, America's quest for new frontiers has seen it build further and faster than any empire before.
The frontier thesis presents a simple story which is complicated by the fact that there were other people, other well-organized societies on the continent.
Through its rapid ascendance to become the dominant global superpower, America has transcended frontiers unlike any other empire in history.
The idea that the United States is just nation building on an empty continent doesn't square with reality.
Its dominance through military power, cultural influence, and scientific supremacy have permeated the globe in ways no ancient empire could ever have believed possible, challenging even what many once considered to be the final frontier. In this episode of Empire Builders, we explore 14 pivotal sites, charting the incredible story of how the United States came to rule the world. Following victory in the American Revolutionary War, on July the 4th, 1776, the eastern states, known simply as the 13 Colonies, declared themselves independent from the United Kingdom of Great Britain, thus becoming the founding members of the United States.
As tensions between the American colonies and Britain rose, the Continental Congress met in what to modernize seems like a very small building in the center of Philadelphia, but because of its historical significance as the place where the Declaration of Independence was drafted, it's now known as Independence Hall.
Independence Hall is perhaps one of the most important historical sites in the modern world order. As well as the Declaration of Independence being signed here, the United States Constitution was debated and created here, influencing many nations' constitutions the world over.
The Declaration of Independence is a hugely important document in the founding of the American nation. And what's often remarked is that it's very much an anti-imperial document because it kind of lists all the misdeeds of the British monarch. It's very much about why the British Empire is rotten to the core and why Americans should break away from it.
The Declaration of Independence was also a statement of principles about what the future held for America, what the new United States would be about.
The Declaration of Independence was drafted over 2 months and signed in Independence Hall on July the 4th, 1776. Designed in classic Georgian style with a red brick finish, its architect, Andrew Hamilton, is often credited with designing what was originally named the Pennsylvania State House. However, Hamilton was actually just one of 2 designers responsible for the State House section, built between 1732 and 1751. The original tower was constructed as a wooden spire, which would house the bell that rang out for independence, later becoming known as the Liberty Bell. The bell was temporarily removed as the rotting wooden structure was replaced with brick before its permanent removal in 1852. The original clock had been added at the side in 1753, but demolished and replaced with the much larger one on the tower, although a replica was later installed. Likewise, the building's wings have been demolished and rebuilt to return them to their original design. As the Union set its sights on expansion, it became clear that Philadelphia would be ill-suited to the needs of the growing United States government, prompting a new debate.
The site, Washington D.C., was the subject of heavy speculation by people who bought land in the expectation that this swamp would suddenly become the federal capital.
The Constitution left it up to the first Congress to decide. The first Congress left it up to Washington to decide, and Washington located it pretty near his house.
In his famous farewell address, Washington warned of alliances and entanglement with other nations. Today, however, the city of Washington, D.C. tells the history of a nation heavily embroiled in global affairs, with cemeteries at Arlington and the iconic memorial of Iwo Jima, both testament to a nation shaped and scarred by war. Whilst Washington's address became muted with time, his legacy to the nation is immortalized through his memorial, erected at the intersecting vistas of both the White House and Capitol Hill. Whilst the Continental Congress had voted to build a statue of Washington as early as 1783, the monument was not completed until 1884, 101 years later, with Washington himself scrapping original plans, citing a waste of federal money. The top of the monument houses an observation deck, reached by a grueling 20-minute climb up 897 stairs, though an elevator was later opened. The walls of the structure are just 18 inches thick at the top, becoming 15 foot thick at the base. When opened to the public in 1888, the monument was the world's largest man-made structure, climbing 555 feet, but surpassed by the Eiffel Tower just 1 year later.
Upon its completion in 1884, it was the tallest building that had ever been built in human history. And many assumed that having to build a building of this scale and of this height would require an enormous amount of support inside with iron frames and iron pins and lots of mortar. That isn't the case. It is actually a freestanding stone structure. The Washington Monument is comprised of more than 36,000 blocks of stone, and the stones are simply stacked up. They are locked in place, but they are held in place really solely by their own weight and by gravity. Outwardly, George Washington, the general, the president, at 6'2½", military bearing, commanding presence. Walked into a room, commanded attention. This commands attention, so it's a perfect symbol and memorial for Washington.
When you see the Lincoln Memorial, you see a life-size representation of Lincoln sitting in his chair, looking Lincolnian. Where the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. contains some of Jefferson's great sound bites. Washington is this obelisk, this unknowable sphinx, this object, the founder of a great project.
Washington's vision of the United States certainly assumed it would continue to expand, but at the end of his presidency, the nation ended at the banks of the Mississippi River. And whilst road-building projects sought to connect those remote western frontier lands to the more populous coastal regions, the Mississippi River remained the most effective access inland. Today, the Port of New Orleans is a bustling center of American commerce, processing some 36 million tons of cargo every year.
The Port of New Orleans is among the busiest ports in the world. This was a troubled site to establish a city because we're on a deltaic plain. It's swampy, it's soft. However, it's in a fantastic geographical situation. The one place near the mouth of the Mississippi River whereby if you establish a fort and a city here, you've essentially controlled this vast hinterland of what proved to be the wealthiest valley on earth and its connection to this vast foreland extending through the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and beyond.
The port of New Orleans was the gateway to the interior of the North American continent. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled access to markets, and they really could just stop up American trade. New Orleans was vital.
New Orleans was actually under command of the Spanish in 1800, who caused chaos and risked war when briefly withdrawing American free passage and right of deposit at the port. President Jefferson set about finding a permanent solution when the territory was handed back to the French.
Thomas Jefferson, the president, sent delegates to France to bargain with Napoleon for the port of New Orleans, but they got much more than they bargained for.
While a couple of American diplomats are in Paris negotiating to buy New Orleans, they're astonished to hear this offer from Napoleon's representatives: would you like to buy the entire colony?
Napoleon sold them 800,000 square miles of territory in exchange for just $15 million, virtually doubling the size of the United States.
The territory was signed over inside the old Spanish municipality building of the Cabildo. A ceremony to celebrate the transfer also took place outside the Cabildo on present-day Jackson Square, downtown New Orleans.
The Spanish flag is brought up and down. The French tricolor is then brought up and then brought down, and then the American flag goes up.
The transfer of land was truly vast, with the outcome said to be the greatest land deal in history, and overnight, America expanded hugely into the frontier land to the west. The strategic significance of the port city was not lost upon the British, who attempted to capture it, leading to a tragic defeat in the final battle in the War of 1812.
On the 8th of January 1815, British redcoats descended on the port of New Orleans.
By the time it was done, 2,000 British soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. One of the most important things that came out of the Battle of New Orleans was the trajectory, the historical trajectory of Andrew Jackson. The Battle of New Orleans changed the way Americans saw themselves. A lot of people saw themselves reflected in Jackson. They looked at Andrew Jackson, they said, he's like me. He started with nothing and he's made something of himself. Jackson managed to create an idea in people's heads that we could put aside our differences, we could work together for a common goal, and what was important was we were all Americans.
Glorious in victory, Jackson returned to the Hermitage, his plantation home a short distance from Nashville, Tennessee. Jackson was a large slave owner and was also appointed by President Monroe as commander of armed forces of the southern border, as tensions rose with the Native American tribes in the borderlands of Spanish Florida.
He was assigned to pacify Native American tribes on the border with Spanish Florida. But Jackson took the initiative, as he saw it, pursued those Native American tribes over the border into Spain, executed 2 British subjects who got in his way, and actually seized control of Fort Barrancas, the administrative headquarters of the Spanish in Florida. This caused a huge international incident.
The current Spanish Fort Barrancas was built in 1797. With the fort's capture, Jackson had effectively seized Spanish Florida for the United States.
In May of 1818, when General Andrew Jackson takes out the Spanish Fort Barrancas near this site, what he was doing was basically signaling the end of Spanish Florida. And this is what convinced the Spanish they need to cut their losses, get rid of Florida, and make the best deal they can.
The actions of Jackson divided President Monroe's cabinet, many of whom thought the invasion had been aggressive and unnecessarily brutal. But the weakness of the Spanish occupiers had been exposed, and they were now forced into selling Florida.
The transfer was July 17, 1821, in downtown Pensacola at Plaza Ferdinand. And they would lower the Spanish flag, the American flag was raised, and taken over as the American provisional governor of the new American territory of Florida was who else? General Andrew Jackson.
Built in 1956, the current governor's mansion was inspired by President Jackson's plantation home. Coincidentally, the same architect was responsible for designing Mar-a-Lago, the Florida retreat of President Donald Trump. A known admirer of Jackson, Trump installed a portrait of the former president in the Oval Office shortly after beginning his tenure. Nonetheless, Jackson's legacy remains a controversial one.
Andrew Jackson had an absolutely visceral dislike of Indians, of Native Americans. Even rugged frontiersmen like David Crockett thought that Andrew Jackson was a bit overexcited on the subject of Native American inferiority.
Andrew Jackson hated two things. He hated the British and he hated Native Americans.
On the one hand, he's a military hero, justifiably so, but on the other hand, he is also the author of one of the great tragedies of the Native Americans. He was responsible for the Trail of Tears, the Cherokees that were driven out of their homeland, and he has a really difficult and complex legacy.
Significantly, Spain's agreement to cede Florida also included an agreement relinquishing their claim over portions of New Spain on the western frontier, emboldening America's progress ever westwards. However, many Americans had settled to the south of New Spain, in a sparsely populated region of Mexico known as Tejas, present-day Texas.
Mexico initially sought to encourage Americans to settle in its province of Texas.
Intending to join the United States, Texas had declared itself an independent nation in 1836, the only state of the Union to have ever existed as a republic. A unique sense of individuality with an almost national flavor still defines Texas today, with the Lone Star flag proudly displayed across the vast state. But Mexico initially refused to accept the Texan succession, and the two faced down at the Alamo.
The Alamo was a small mission town, and 200 Texan soldiers were holed up there, surrounded by 15,000 Mexicans.
With a famous church tucked away in an inner courtyard, the Alamo comprised a large walled compound covering some 5 acres. Over 12 days, the Texan forces held out, repelling 2 initial attacks by the Mexicans. The third attack took place at 5:30 a.m. on the morning of March the 10th. With the Mexican army descending upon the Alamo from all sides under cover of darkness. The north wall and the southeast corners provided the main focus of attack, with the Mexicans attempting to overcome the walls with ladders, but the Texans defended their positions. One general, Juan Armadale, noticed that the makeshift north wall had been constructed with small gaps providing toe holes, making it easy to climb, and charged his men to scale it. Once inside the fort, Armadale was able to open the postern in the north wall from inside, and Mexican soldiers poured through. Texan forces retreated to the barracks and chapel, with Davy Crockett and his men the last in the open, famously defending the iconic church.
The battle siege lasted 13 days, and at the end, not a single American was left alive.
On securing the Alamo, the Mexican general Santa Anna ordered his men to take no prisoners, and the remaining Texans were summarily executed.
The fact that the Mexicans had massacred the defenders, as Americans would see it, the fact that the Mexicans had paid no heed to the desire of Texans to be independent, strongly suggested to the American popular imagination that Texas belonged in the United States of America.
Today, crowds still flock to the remains of the original Spanish mission, bearing witness to the site of Davy Crockett's famous last stand. The vivid icon of American frontier spirit and his courage in the face of unassailable odds established a legacy that makes the Alamo almost certainly the most important site in American folklore.
Remember the Alamo became a rallying cry for Texan independence. Shortly thereafter, at the Battle of San Jacinto, a Texan army overcame a larger Mexican army in a fight that lasted just 18 minutes. With that, Texan independence was won.
With the city of Austin as state capital, Texas finally joined the Union in 1845. The following year, a provocative approach was made to also purchase California and New Mexico from Mexico for $30 million. But President James K. Polk's representative was not even received by Mexican President Jose Herrera, and following a skirmish in the contested region between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River, American soldiers were killed, placing the two nations squarely on a footing to war.
President James K. Polk's decision to declare war on Mexico proved incredibly controversial. Many Americans suspected that Polk and his associates had engineered Mexico into a confrontation simply in order to grab more land for American expansion. A young congressman named Abraham Lincoln called on Polk to show him the exact spot of soil on which American blood had been spilt. Was it really on the American side of the border, as Polk had claimed, or had American soldiers strayed into Mexico?
Military superiority was evident, with victory swift and decisive. Cowed in defeat, Mexico was forced to cede territories that make up all of the present-day California, Nevada, and Utah, along with the majority of New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado, and parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. It was a truly massive transfer of territory, for which Mexico was compensated only $15 million, half of what was originally offered for just 2 states. The nation now straddled the continent, sea to shining sea.
It was quite clear that the purpose behind provoking a war with Mexico was to expand the amount of territory on which the United States could settle slave systems of labor.
But with the Civil War, America became divided. Nation building was sidelined, including grand plans to connect the country by a transcontinental rail network.
The United States wanted to go ahead and build that transcontinental railroad from the 1850s, but sectional disputes between North and South. Where should that railroad begin? Should it go from New Orleans? Should it be a southern railroad to California? Which should be a northern one? All that had prevented construction. And so once the Confederacy left, it freed up that problem.
With the secession of the South, the northern representatives agreed that the Transcontinental Railroad should run from Iowa to San Francisco in California. An act was passed in 1863, but the railroad wasn't completed until 6 years later.
In the aftermath of the Civil War, construction on the Transcontinental Railroad began, a grand project that would begin the lengthy process of healing a war-weary America.
This was the way to keep the East and the West tied together. Already the North and South had broken apart, and they needed that rail to bind the country. All total, the United States had 30,000 miles of rail, more than all the rest of the rails in the world combined. But the North outnumbered Southern mileage by 3 to 1. I mean, literally, Union forces rode to victory on the rails. It was the great advantage that Northern forces had over the Confederacy.
This northern routing of the Transcontinental Railroad was complicated by the necessity to somehow navigate the Sierra Nevada mountain range, and engineers made slow progress excavating through a wall of solid granite rock. The lines from east and west were eventually united on May the 10th, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, where a golden final spike was driven in celebration.
Standing at the location where they completed the Transcontinental Railroad on May 10th, 1869, this was a very significant event in changing everything, not maybe even just within the United States, but throughout the world.
Not only did the Transcontinental Railroad change the way Americans would travel, but established standardized time zones across the nation and improved communications, with telegraph wires erected to run in parallel the length of the new tracks. The grand infrastructure project was now complete and required a grand gateway.
Where we are right now is the very introduction to transcontinental railroad travel in the United States of America. Besides being known as Grand Central Terminal, it was known as the gateway to the nation. People would come here to begin their travels across this country. This was a germination of transcontinental railroading.
Financed by the Vanderbilt family, the station was constructed to the highest modern standards, with electrification throughout, and a huge subterranean generator constructed beneath street level. In the main halls, ornate chandeliers proudly exhibit their light bulb fittings, carved amidst clusters of acorns and oak leaves, the insignia of the Vanderbilt family crest, adorning this bold threshold to the American continent.
Customers and passengers will come here to head out to develop new lives, new industry, new business across this nation, in the Midwest, in the West, and undeveloped areas, to begin their life and to develop the life of this country as well.
That's where American economy really took off, is once they got that rail system to create a national market for the whole country, east, west, north, south.
The Transcontinental Railroad was a private enterprise. The whole period after the Civil War can be seen as this clash between private enterprises and the little guy.
With federal support, the growth of powerful corporations saw a period of rapid high-tech industrialization. Productivity soared, and these companies generated massive wealth, much of which was appropriated by their owners.
There are lots and lots of men who at that time became extremely rich. Two of them, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, they are still in lists of, say, the 10 richest people of all time.
In his spiritual home of Pittsburgh, the fabulously wealthy Carnegie set about constructing a legacy of philanthropic projects, championing the arts, culture, and education. But to the city and Carnegie himself, the lifeblood was heavy industry. His largest project cemented Pittsburgh's position as a modern American powerhouse. Dwarfing the competition in both size and output, the Homestead Steel Mill was a cathedral of industrial might and set the standard for steel production for the next century. The Homestead Steelworks were constructed across a site of some 430 acres with a bank of blast furnaces named the Carey furnaces, standing 92 feet. Carey number 6 and 7 are the only two furnaces that still remain. Lined with thick steel plate and an outer skin of refractory brick, these giant furnaces would consume 4 tons of raw materials for every ton of iron produced. With a cooling system that required over 5 million gallons of water a day, the Carey furnaces made Homestead the world's leading steel producer for nearly 80 years. Carey 6 and 7 were taken offline in 1978, but are registered as sites of national historic importance. America had industrialized at a truly unprecedented rate. With it, the economic growth that created enormous fortunes also led to huge growth in inequality, and tensions between workers and owners soon surfaced.
Industrialization had huge benefits for the United States. It made the nation richer than it had ever been before, and it made many Americans richer too. But it also brought with it a host of associated problems.
This is a time of huge and tremendous change. We have a lot of innovation, we have a lot of novelty, but we also have a lot of strife, a lot of misery.
Cities became dirty and overcrowded. Tensions between labor and capital rose.
Carnegie's Homestead Mill gained notoriety as home to one of America's most brutal labor disputes in 1892, in which steelworkers and strikebreakers clashed viciously, with fatalities on both sides.
The Homestead strike was one of the most violent and shocking, really, events in the struggle between capital and labor in the 19th century. And what really troubled a lot of people at the time was the way in which it was crushed. It was crushed ruthlessly.
Although the steelworkers at Homestead were defeated, the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt would meet popular demand for shift in domestic policy to take on these big corporations. But Roosevelt's foreign policy would continue on a far more assertive trajectory.
The Turner thesis was originally prompted by fear, a fear that a distinctive epoch in American history had come to an end, that there was no more frontier. What would happen next?
Turner's thesis really fed into contemporary debates at the turn of the century about imperialism. If America no longer had a frontier to expand to on the North American continent, should it look overseas to continue that expansion? And that question really divided Americans, those who believed that expansion was necessary for the nation's growth and survival, from those who believed that America must not become another empire.
The Spanish-controlled island of Cuba had been the initial focus for those who believed America should now be projecting its power abroad.
So Cuba is a Spanish colony. Lots of Americans live on this island. There are lots of American business interests. There's unrest on Cuba. The United States sends a warship to protect the interests of its citizens. This battleship, the Maine, explodes. Americans lose their lives. The Spanish are blamed. This is interpreted as an act of war. The conflict between Spain and the United States really starts. They don't just fight them in Cuba, they also fight them far away in the Pacific. And that's how it acquires the Philippines. There are other Spanish possessions that also fall to America, Puerto Rico, Guam. So the United States, all of a sudden, acquires quite a bit of territory.
The Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the Spanish-American War, significantly increased the United States' territorial footprint around the world. The Philippine revolutionary government refused to recognize American sovereignty, but the U.S. eventually granted independence to the island nation at the end of the Pacific War in World War II, a war in which the U.S. would pay a heavy price, taking back its colonies from the Japanese. Guam and Puerto Rico would remain United States territories, with the latter even honoring visiting presidents, with bronze statues at the Puerto Rican Capitol building.
One of the indirect outcomes of the Spanish-American War is the establishing of a military base in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay. And throughout the 20th century, the United States acquires more and more of these overseas military bases.
If the outbreak of the Spanish-American War had set a precedent that the U.S. was prepared to protect its economic interests abroad, that would be reinforced some months later as the U.S. confirmed the annexation of Hawaii.
So the case of Hawaii is really a case of a small, independent island kingdom. There are a lot of American economic interests on the island. There are a lot of American sugar businesses, sugar planters. They basically run the economy of Hawaii. But Hawaii has an indigenous monarch, a queen called Liliuokalani, but she is ousted by these American planters who get her to abdicate, and then the route is open for annexation of Hawaii by the United States.
Queen Liliuokalani was placed under house arrest and confined to a single room at the ornate Iolani Palace. This bastion of Hawaiian Renaissance style was commissioned by the last Hawaiian king, who had sought to infuse classical styles with a uniquely Hawaiian aesthetic, producing this enduring symbol to the Hawaiian national identity.
America moved from a country which was experiencing westward expansion towards a country which was acquiring an empire.
There are multiple interventions, and these are backed up by a new political ideology. And that's the idea that the United States is really responsible for the Western Hemisphere. It's the policeman in the Western Hemisphere.
Of all the interventions throughout this period, the most strategically significant would concern a small strip of land in what was then northern Colombia. With the United States now embarking on a new internationalist chapter, President Teddy Roosevelt saw control of a waterway linking the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans as vital in consolidating his nation's regional ascendancy. Indeed, Roosevelt would take extraordinary action to ensure this canal's construction.
It's almost a classic sort of intervention in Latin American affairs. He encourages a rebellion in Colombia. He encourages the region of Panama to break away, to form a new state so that he can build his canal. And this is eventually what happens. So it's an intervention in Colombian affairs. It's something that is utterly disregarding the sovereignty of another nation. But Roosevelt does it anyway, because for him the strategic gain is so important.
Finally opened officially in 1914, the Panama Canal rises 64 feet between mountains, cutting a passage between the American continents 51 miles in length. At $350 million, it was the most expensive project ever undertaken by the US, requiring 3.4 million cubic meters of concrete and employing some 56,000 workers. Staggeringly, 5,609 workers were recorded killed during the US construction phase.
The Panama Canal essentially slices the Americas in half. It very conveniently makes it possible to move warships extremely quickly from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
The United States agreement with the newly formed nation of Panama established the Canal Zone as an unincorporated territory of the United States, with rights for use, occupation, and control in perpetuity. Virtual sovereignty.
There is a theory that in the 1890s the United States turns to empire. But another way of looking at it is really that the United States is already an empire. Because if empire means ruling others, then the United States is doing that. Continental expansion is empire building.
Significantly ending its long-standing commitment to neutrality, the US emerged victorious with the Allies in World War I, and the nation was brimming with self-confidence, building great monuments to its success. Nowhere was this expression of confidence more evident than in New York City, which by 1925 had become the most populous city in the world, with a population of nearly 8 million. It had been less than 200,000 just 100 years before. At the heart of the city, in Midtown Manhattan, the Rockefeller family constructed the Rockefeller Center, a complex of 19 skyscrapers set over 22 acres. Just a few blocks away, automotive boss Walter P. Chrysler commissioned the Chrysler Building as a monument to me, embodying this spirit of naked individualism. A gargantuan Art Deco column of steel and brick, it was to be the tallest building in the world. Alas for Chrysler, a record it held for less than a year. The Empire State Building was constructed in just 1 year and 45 days and is considered an icon of classic Art Deco-style architecture. The 86th floor hosts an open-air viewing gallery with an enclosed observatory on the 102nd floor. The 103rd floor has an additional open-air viewing gallery but is considered unsafe for public access due to its small size and low guard railing. Atop the building is an antenna, added only in 1950, as the spire was originally designed as a mooring mast for airships, but strong air currents in New York made this impractical. The Empire State Building was the tallest building in the world from its opening in 1931 right through to 1972, when it was finally surpassed by the World Trade Center.
The Great Depression was immensely damaging to the American spirit. The President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, talked about a frontier of hunger and fear that Americans had to overcome.
The Empire State Building was seen by some as an act of great hubris, standing largely empty for years after its completion, and gaining the nickname the Empty State Building. With the economy reeling, the nation now looked west, where a completely new industry was being born. One that would set the gaze of the world on a nation like never before.
In the 1920s, we have a huge expansion of the export of American movies around the world. The Americans were just incredibly good at producing movies, but also at distributing them. That's what Hollywood does so well.
Answering the call of the fledgling movie industry, tens of thousands relocated west. Dedicated picture houses proliferated, with Los Angeles spawning a unique brand of Art Deco architecture. And American movies were shown all across the world.
America's preeminent position in the world in the latter half of the 20th century isn't, of course, just down to its military or even its political power. We also talk about something called soft power, the kind of cultural power that America is able to exert. And nothing illustrates that as well as Hollywood.
The eponymous Hollywood sign is an iconic landmark, synonymous with the cinema and film industry of the foothills below, but it was originally constructed for quite a different purpose. Erected in 1923, it was originally constructed as an elaborate billboard for a real estate development and read Hollywood Land. Each of the letters was 30 foot wide and approximately 43 foot tall, supported by intricate frames of scaffold, pipes, wires, and telephone poles. At night, the sign would blink sequentially, illuminating the word in 3 parts, so as to make it memorable. The word land was eventually removed by the LA Parks Department in the late 1940s. By now, the US was not only leading the world culturally, but militarily.
America entered World War II as just one of the great military powers, but it ended World War II as the dominant force in the world. And of course, America has demonstrated the awesome military power at its disposal with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
By dropping the bomb, you demonstrate what it can do. So this was all about showing the Soviet Union what the United States is capable of.
In this new environment where any conflict risked complete annihilation, the emergent Cold War powers were forced to demonstrate their superiority within new arenas.
America was always looking for new ways to expand, not just in terms of territory. In the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy challenged Americans to conquer a new frontier in technology, and particularly in space exploration.
Tragically, Kennedy would not live to see the fulfillment of his promise, but the idea of a manned mission to the moon captured the world's imagination, and NASA launched the Apollo space program. It funded construction of the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral in Florida, and in Houston, Texas, the Johnson Space Center. Originally named the Manned Spaceflight Center, the facility was renamed in 1973 as a tribute to the late President Johnson, a Texan native. Spread over 1,700 acres just southeast of downtown Houston, the center employs almost 10,000 people and has been at the forefront of the Apollo and Space Shuttle programs throughout their lifespan, offering a dedicated astronaut training facility integral to the first lunar mission.
If you are the nation, the first nation to put a man on the moon, that means that you are really at the vanguard of what humans can achieve. And the Cold War, because it was a Cold War, was always not just about military power, it was also about your way of life and how attractive it is.
Following the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 1980s, America continued to see itself as a kind of world policeman. advocates for an interventionist American foreign policy have pointed to the need to defend democratic values as they see them in its interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan.
In addition to the catastrophic intervention in Vietnam, the 20th and early 21st centuries have seen multiple military actions by US forces abroad. Critics often argue that these interventions represent a continuation of a foreign policy that protects US economic interests, specifically oil. But others assert that these interventions have more to do with a uniquely American mission abroad.
With the United States now seeing itself as acting no longer on simply a continental or hemispheric stage, but a world stage, some Americans see these interventions in far-flung parts of the globe as fighting new battles on a new frontier for American values.
At the start of the 21st century, it's American domination of a quite different sphere that has shaped civilization most profoundly. Not outer space, but cyberspace. The cyber revolution took root a short journey from San Francisco, in the small Northern California town of Palo Alto, with alumni from the adjacent Stanford University famously transforming suburban garages into makeshift research labs, the spiritual home of what would become Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley, of course, is the heart of the American tech industry, and it's no coincidence that it's located in California, almost as far west as you can get on the American continent.
When people come to San Francisco, the first thing that they notice is like people are dressed weird, they're not always clothed, they do drugs and have different ideas of marriage and sexuality. That is not an accident for why the technology sector is also here.
In many ways, Silicon Valley embodies that American frontier spirit, the entrepreneurialism, the individualism.
Mostly people who started coming when I started tour guiding were people who had familiarity with what was happening. They were fellow engineers, fellow entrepreneurs. These days, people come because they are connected through Facebook and Yahoo and Google, and they want to see what they're connected to, and they want to see the Silicon Valley, and unfortunately I can only show them buildings and car parks. So they're not very happy.
But while Silicon Valley has traditionally been comprised of low-rise offices, typical to any unremarkable technology park, this has begun to change. Facebook's new headquarters is a sprawling campus of environmentally sensitive modernity. Tumbling terraces of irregular parkland cover the vast roofs, punctuated by a seemingly random array of windows to maximize natural light. A design informed by the company's themes of non-uniformity and free expression, the architecture somehow rejects grandiose overtures, though its massive scale is a statement nonetheless. However, it is Apple's new Palo Alto headquarters that takes architectural statement to an entirely different level. The Apple Corporation's enormous Apple Park is a gargantuan monument to the corporation's status as the world's most valuable, with estimates of construction cost in excess of $5 billion. Approximately a mile in circumference, the facility is based on the principle of a continuous loop.
You see a lot of tech companies without a lot of office walls, with kind of long, narrow corridors, and these are purposefully architected so that people will bump into each other.
Perhaps appropriately nicknamed the spaceship, Apple Park is the jewel that crowns Silicon Valley king in this new dominion of global power.
The spaceship was the vision of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs had a very serious penchant for design. He was very unhappy with anything that didn't meet his criteria for perfection of design.
Apple Park, you know, somewhere down there in Silicon Valley, it's a statement. And, you know, Silicon Valley is littered with the office buildings of companies that were once on top of the world and then passed by. It's kind of a foolish act of hubris to build, you know, a colossal monument to yourself as your headquarters.
The construction of Apple's new campus is a pretty big sign that Silicon Valley thinks it's going to be around for a long time, and that it will continue to grow, and that this area will continue to be the epicenter of innovation.
And if people start saying, I don't like you anymore, I don't trust you anymore, I don't believe in the promise of what you're offering me, they start to go somewhere else. And it may take, a short time, or it may take a long time, but that's why companies fail, it's why empires fail.
Before Silicon Valley, it was the railroads. And then it was New York with skyscrapers. And then the space race.
American history has been defined by this drive to conquer the frontier.
And the land was no longer a factor when there was no more frontier to go, and the westward movement was stifled because of the end of the continent. Then there had to be new frontiers to conquer.
In the 1890s, Frederick Jackson Turner worried that with the end of the continental frontier, those energies would dissipate. But in fact, we've seen in the New Deal, John F. Kennedy's new frontier of space exploration, that actually they've been redirected.
Culminating in what we see today with the innovation of companies that solve all our problems. You have a problem, they have an answer.
As we move further into the 21st century, is what we see today the high watermark of American empire? Or will these energies be once again redirected into a new frontier?